Okay, awesome. So I'm out in West Tennessee today. I've been driving around the last couple of days, and there's some good-looking crops out there. So hopefully we can get some agreeable weather as we enter this pre-harvest and harvest period. I think there's some good crops out there if we can get them in the bins. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm obviously going to talk quickly about a quick corn and soybean supply and demand update, give some indications of where prices might be going, and then talk a little bit just in general, some harvest and post-harvest marketing strategies, just so that we have things fresh in our mind about some of the considerations we might want to evaluate as we move into the pre-harvest and harvest period, just so that we don't leave some money on the table from a marketing standpoint. So first off, I'm going to talk about corn. In Tennessee, like I mentioned, most of the crops driving around middle, east, and west Tennessee have been in excellent condition. There are some areas that suffered from some wet conditions in planting, so there are some bare areas, but overall, the Tennessee crop is looking very good. There's other parts of the U.S. that aren't looking as good, and I'll kind of go through a couple of those areas and discuss what kind of the ramifications of those reduced national average yields could be as far as price prospects go. So the first thing, I'm not going to dwell on international stuff today, but I do want everybody to be cognizant of it is a global marketplace. We are one cog in the wheel. For corn, we are the largest exporter, exporting an estimated 2.23 billion bushels last year, and this year we're estimated to take a little bit of a step back on that, but still that's going to be more of a function of having some increased export competition from Brazil due to them not having the drought conditions they had last year. But again, for corn, we are still the dominant exporter. When we look at where that corn is going, this is one that is very different than soybeans. I've kind of been beating this drum for a while. Corn, you have a substantial amount of or a diverse group of purchasers for imports. If you look at this large blue bar, again, that is the rest of the world. So again, yes, Mexico, South Korea, Japan, the EU, Egypt, and to a small extent, China are purchasers of raw corn, but it is a very diverse portfolio, which gives you kind of a bit of a risk mitigation as opposed to when you look at soybeans where you're talking a one country importer. So it is important to realize that, because obviously with some of the talk about potential bilateral trade negotiations, there are risks that are present that could end up dramatically influencing the market if there was something that did adversely affect trade between countries. This is kind of a good news, bad news set of circumstances. If you look, the orange or the light orange bar here would be consumption over time, and the blue dotted bar would be production. So again, we both have upward sloping consumption and production. The bottom bars on the bottom show ending stocks. So that's essentially if you have world consumption and world production. If you have production above consumption, you're going to increase stocks. If you have consumption below or above production, you're going to decrease stocks. So you can see that for corn, this is on a world scale. So this includes the U.S. And all other countries. Since 2010, we've actually been building those world stocks. Just one sec here. And so what we've ended up seeing is that we've seen a build in stocks from 2010 all the way up until 2016. 2017 is actually the first year on a global scale that we're going to see potentially a bit of a step back and a reduction in stocks, which is obviously a positive for prices. A lot of people, this might kind of surprise because of 2012. 2012, the U.S. stocks hit a low, but there were some other countries, particularly China, that were really aggressively growing their stocks, and the rest of the world wasn't adversely affected through drought. So we didn't see a big uptick, but at the same time, we didn't bottom out in 2012. So obviously, the stocks are when you're influence price, you have to kind of take a look at stocks, but you also have to look at it relative to consumption. So this is just a quick measure on inventory of days on hand. So essentially, it takes U.S. and world ending stocks divided by what the domestic consumption was. So again, you can kind of see this highlights that 2012 effect in the U.S. where we dropped down to 29 days on hand. But since then, we've been growing up until 2016. 2017, again, we're looking at taking a step back on those days of inventory on hand, both in the U.S. and the world from where they've been in 2016, which should translate into a little bit higher prices. Now, when we look at this from a historical context, we're not back in that $5 corn range that we were in 2011 to 2013. That's not something that is going to happen unless there's a crop issue in another part of the world, such as South America. But it is important to note that we are potentially moving in the right direction. We're going to have to see where this harvest comes in at, but there's some signs that we might be able to move in the right direction. So again, as we're looking at marketing alternatives, we can think of, does it make sense to store this crop versus, say, a soybeans? And that's an individual choice, but again, those are the types of considerations we want to be evaluating. I mentioned the crop progress in Tennessee, which is this chart on the left-hand side. In 2017, you can see we're actually quite a bit better off, about 80% good to excellent compared to last year. Obviously, we had the severe drought down in southern middle Tennessee and then also parts of West Tennessee. So this year, I think we're going to have a lot better crop than last year. If you look at where we are relative to the rest of the U.S., 2016 is up around 75% good to excellent, where 2017 has been trending down to that 60% good to excellent. So we've seen the national crop kind of take a step back in 2017, whereas the Tennessee crop's actually taken a pretty good jump forward. So again, we'll probably have higher yields than where we were last year, which again, that's going to help the bottom line. Now the key is to get that higher price. There's going to be kind of two effects. Obviously, with lower national production, you should see a moderate increase or a little bit higher price than where it was last year on a national scale. But again, that's probably going to eat into our basis on a local level because there's going to be more corn for purchase in Tennessee. One thing that we are fortunate, and this is kind of a counterbalancing effect, is that we don't have the on-farm storage that carried over some of the stocks that the Midwest did into this next marketing year. So we don't necessarily have to deal with as big of an issue on the carryover side as some of the other major corn producing areas. So that's an important point to note. When we look at stocks to use, I mentioned you can't just look at stocks because both consumption and production are increasing over time. What this does, it gives you an idea of what the relationship between stocks to use is, and this is nationally. So you can see that as your stocks to use on the horizontal axis increases, your price decreases, which is basic supply and demand. If you have more of a product relative to your consumption, you'll have a lower price for that. And so again, these are estimates, but you get kind of a downward sloping. This little equation here, all it indicates is that for every 1% increase you have in U.S. stocks to use, you have about a 28-cent decrease in the marketing or average price of corn. So it's just a rule of thumb, a rough estimate as to see where we see prices going. But it is a valuable tool when you're looking at potentially predicting where prices could be. Switch it up quickly to soybeans. Again, I mentioned corn. There are a lot more players in soybeans. You're essentially looking at Argentina and Brazil, and that does add a bit of a wrinkle because since we are in different hemispheres, the production seasons don't line up. So when you look at potential export market implications, Brazil will be planting their soybean crop this fall and then harvesting it February, March into April. So again, what you end up having is you have these two different production periods. So even though we'll have a bit of a carryover in soybeans and we'll have a reasonably good crop, a lot of our price direction this winter is going to be dictated on South American weather. So it does add another layer of complexity when you're looking at your marketing decisions. I did mention this as a substantial risk. Obviously, we all know China purchases a ton of soybeans, but if you look at it relative to the rest of the world, it is striking how reliant we are on that market. Now, I don't foresee this changing dramatically as we move forward, but anytime you end up having one entity that is purchasing all of a product, your risk is aligned with them. So if there is something that happens in China, at times the Chinese government can be somewhat, we'll call it unpredictable. That can have dramatic impact on what's going to end up potentially happening with soybean prices. Because if we end up seeing our exports end up decreasing to China, we would have dramatic price implications domestically. Again, it's that same chart where you have consumption in orange, and then production is the dotted line. You can kind of again see that this is on a world scale. Kind of bottomed out around 2011, then we've been building. 2016 is where we really actually got that big jump from 2.8 to 3.5, and we're looking to take a minor step back this upcoming year. Again, days on hand, this is one where it's a little bit different than corn. If you look at the U.S. in particular, we didn't bottom out in 2012. We actually bottomed out in 2013. We stayed pretty low as far as inventory on hand relative to consumption in 2014 and 2015. Now, unlike corn, we are estimated to continue to increase that domestically. And a lot of that is due to adding that 3 million additional acres. Now, yield, obviously, the old saying is that soybeans are made in August. So we do still have more production variability in soybeans than, say, potentially corn. I think there's still both relatively unknown, but there's more potential to have a change in the fortunes of soybeans than there is at corn at this point. You look at global ending stocks relative to consumption. Again, we've seen a building, but again, we're looking at potentially maybe taking a step back. The one that will really dictate whether we do take this step back is what happens in Brazil. Last year, they had a very good crop. 2015, they had some dry conditions, which caused their production to fall. So again, this is going to be very important as we move forward. Now, some of the influences that went on domestically. Obviously, I think most people have read or heard about the drought in the northern plains, specifically the Dakotas. One thing that I think might surprise a few people is if you look at the corn numbers. I don't think this will surprise, but 3.45 and 4.8 million acres, so roughly 9 to 10% of U.S. production is coming from the Dakotas. You look at soybeans, 7.15 and 5.36 million acres. You're talking 14% of the U.S. production is coming from those two states. Now, obviously, the soybean and corn main producing area is going to be right along this eastern edge of the Dakotas, whereas the dominant drought factor has been out in the western side where you're into wheat country. But at the same time, when you're talking this type of acreage, if you get substantial yield reductions, which is what most people are projecting, that does have the ability to provide some support for prices. 14% of the market, the domestic production, is a substantial amount that does have the potential to move the market. Now, part of the other thing I will say is that a lot of that has been factored in. I'm sure as much as I've looked at the markets, they've been very choppy the last month. So we've seen a tremendous amount of volatility as markets try to gauge what that damage is to the actual production number. So again, we look at where we're at. This is the United States. We're down well below what our soybean crop conditions are in 2017 compared to this orange line of 2016. So we would anticipate lower yields on that. In Tennessee, again, we're kind of following where we were in 2016. Part of that is due to some of the wet conditions that we had in the spring. So it'll probably track somewhere reasonably close to where we were last year in production. There's going to be some spots that are better. There's going to be some spots that are a little bit worse. So again, we'll see how August finishes up. We're still relatively early in August. So I don't want to read too much into those numbers at this time. Again, you look at stocks to use ratios, and you can see that we still have that downward sloping line. So as you increase U.S. stocks to use ratio, you end up seeing price decrease over time. The relationship's not as strong as it was for corn. So if we look at kind of where we see prices going, I kind of pulled four different sources. We have obviously this CBOT, which is the Chicago futures. These are the harvest futures contract number. Corn right now is trading right around 390 or 385. Soybeans at 978. The Congressional Budget Office has corn. This is a marketing year average price. So again, we have to be cautious with how we interpret this number, because essentially what they are trying to get at here is this is what the average price would be for a bushel of corn across the U.S. So obviously this would factor into the strong negative basis that they would have in areas like Iowa and Illinois, and that would be partially counterbalanced by some of the areas that have strong positive basis, such as Tennessee. So again, you have to be careful how this is interpreted, but you can kind of get a general idea of where they see prices going. FAPRI, which is out of Missouri, has 360 and 957. And most people are familiar with the USDA's WASDE report, and they provide a range. So this can be looked at as kind of an average cash price as well, somewhere between 290 and 370. Obviously, in Tennessee, we're probably going to be on the high end of this, probably a little bit higher than this range in some circumstances. Now, with a good-looking crop coming in Tennessee, we probably won't get the basis opportunities that we had this past year, just because local supply is going to be higher, and we're not going to get that influence. Soybeans, a little bit wider range. I mentioned there's still a lot of volatility left in soybean markets as we enter August. So if we look at where December corn futures have been, this is for the last 3 years. So the black line is 2015. The red line is 2016. You can see we've been very range bound on the harvest futures contract. So if you look, we've traded 450 to 325. So $1.25 range is what we looked at. We got these nice little price spikes in May, June, and then into July in 2015. This year we didn't quite get that, but we did have some time where futures markets were above $4 again in July. So hopefully we were able to take advantage of some of those pricing opportunities. I think as we move into harvest, we'll likely see prices kind of flatten out on the futures side, kind of trade in that $3.50 to $4 range. If we do get some shocks on the yield side, we could actually see it maybe challenge that $4 before, or as we move through the harvest period here. A lot of it will depend on where those actual yields are coming in at. Now this one here, this is specific to Tennessee. So if we look at what this chart shows, is it shows which months we have the highest average price relative to the marketing year average price. This goes from 2006 to 2016. So essentially what this indicates is that as of July, typically in Tennessee, or on average over the last 10 years, what we've seen the price being 58 cents over what the marketing year average price was for corn. Again, it makes a lot of sense. As we enter into harvest, we see that price premium evaporate. Now, one thing that is important to note is we're still, even though it's 9 cents lower than the marketing year average, it's a lot better than selling corn typically in September and October. So again, looking for some of those early corn pricing opportunities, you're going to potentially get a bit of a premium for those if you can get it out of the field and to the users. Even in August, it's not going to be, the stored corn that you had in May, June, and July, but at the same time, a couple cents a bushel when we have a pretty good crop can make a huge difference in that bottom line. So again, knowing these types of trends in prices is important. Switch it up to soybeans. I mentioned the volatility in soybeans. Much wider trading range than corn. So if you look, we've got a high of 11.50 back in 2016, and we got down below $9 in both 2016 and 2015. This market, I still think that there's going to be a bunch of volatility that's left in this market, both as we finish up the U.S. or start the U.S. harvest as we move into September and October. But again, that influence of the South American production is also going to create more volatility than, say, corn as we move through the winter marketing season. Similar pattern to corn as far as average monthly price premium. So again, marketing year average price can be deemed as zero, and you look at August, there's a 16-cent premium relative to that average marketing year price. But again, when you get into that September, October, you have to sell off the combine. You're looking about a 90-cent discount to what the marketing year average price will end up being on average. So again, looking at these opportunities, if you do have, it's probably a little bit more difficult for soybeans than corn. But again, it's very important to understand these types of seasonal relationships, and then also prioritize on-farm storage or commercial storage. So if we look at actual strategies, what you can do as far as harvest and post-harvest pricing. The first one I'm sure everybody's very familiar with is cash sales. You're selling the crop off the combine. I mentioned, or if you got some early harvested acreage, look for those, actively seek out those price premiums and see if you can end up obtaining those. A couple cents a bushel is a big deal, particularly if we get yields up in that 170. Some people have 200 plus bushel corn. A couple cents makes a big difference to that bottom line. The other one I do want to note for this is, I mean, you still can use a cash forward contract on something like this as well, right? Obviously, if you have a little bit late harvested corn, you can end up finding something that meets your needs from a price standpoint. It's okay to look at those types of things as well. One thing that's positive right now is obviously the range of yield outcomes across Tennessee has narrowed. It's not in the bin, so I'm not gonna say that you should have 100% of your crop priced. But you can end up increasing that price to a little bit higher level as long as you feel your production's there, which again, since we've kind of made it through the key production period, you can probably be a little bit more aggressive in getting a little bit more priced even before it's in the bin without taking on additional production risk. Futures, again, I still think that there's a lot of uncertainty up in that northern Corn Belt states. Is it priced into the market? I don't know. That's a tough one to look at. But again, selling some rallies because I think our basis is going to tighten a little bit. So looking at the futures market to potentially sell a rally might be something that is worthwhile to investigate. The other big one is storage. If you have on-farm storage or commercial storage, you should look at the options that are available to you. Prioritize which crops will be stored and which ones will be marketed. Right now, there's going to be more volatility in soybeans, but I can see corn kind of creeping up depending on where you are within the state. So again, you're going to have to weigh the pros and cons of storing either one of those crops. The other one that we kind of usually gloss over is having storage can help you get the crop out of the field. We know we've got a tight harvest window. We have an unknown weather influence that can dramatically affect how quickly we can get the crop out. So that gives you a good tool that you can use in order to get that crop out on a timely basis. Extending the marketing window. So again, I showed the price of Tennessee, or the chart of Tennessee prices. If you look at extending that window, it opens up additional opportunities as we move into winter and into the new year that you can potentially take advantage of. So we look at post-harvest pricing. Obviously, there's a bunch of options here as well. You can store and then price that crop later. You can deliver a crop and price it later. You can store, and then you can still use those same marketing alternatives that you used at the beginning of the year and through the growing season. You can still buy a put option, buy one out in March or May to get a price floor under stored bushels. You can sell a deferred contract. It works the same way as a traditional short hedge. Again, you're looking at deferred futures contracts, and you can still cash contract for future delivery. So even though you're storing it, again, we can end up simultaneously doing stuff with potentially looking at securing a price, or at least a futures or maybe a basis price on that production. The other one, that if you don't have storage, you can still potentially take advantage of price rallies. And there's other option strategies. This one is kind of a simple. I'll step through a quick example on this, but you can sell the cash crop and then buy a call. And I'll show them an example of this. Or you can sell the cash crop and buy a deferred futures contract. So you don't physically own the commodity anymore, but you can still take advantage in a rally in the futures market. So just to kind of give you a quick example of this, you can sell the crop in the cash market and buy a call option. I pulled these numbers last night. So if you sell the crop at harvest, you buy a 4.20 call. The premium right now is 14 cents. The nice thing that people like typically about options is they know what their risk exposure is. So the absolute maximum you could lose using this strategy would be 14 cents a bushel. Your break even is if the March corn contract between harvest and expiration, so March 15th, gets above 434. Anytime it gets above 434, that's going to be your profit. So your March corn contract minus 434 is going to be what the profit is on this. This chart kind of highlights that. So if you look at that 420 strike price, if it stays at 420 for the whole next 4 months, you get a 14-cent loss, which is the premium. Anything below 420, the March corn contract, is going to be a 14-cent loss. There's no accelerated loss moving to the downside. If you look as prices increase, 430, you're still losing that 4 cents because you've only made 10 cents of that premium back. Once you get into 440, that's when you start to see these gains occur. Again, one of the big things that I do want to emphasize on this too is when you're using options, timing is everything. You want to make sure that just because the price gets above a certain level, you still have to exercise the option on that contract to enter into the futures market so that you can realize on that gain. So again, it does take a little bit more active management or having somebody do this for you. And I will close with saying futures and options are not for everyone. There are real risks when you use futures and options. So again, you want to make sure that you understand all the risks if you're doing the trading, or if you are paying somebody, a broker or an elevator, to end up doing these strategies for you. You want to make sure that you understand all the risks before you enter into any of these types of strategies.